start by sharing a little bit about your journey to co-founding Sur Legal Collaborative and what inspired you to form this organization?
Yeah, so the journey to starting Sur Legal, I think really does go back to the beginning of my legal career when saw a group of us as social justice attorneys, women of color, saw the need for a space that was values aligned in terms of living the values that we espoused for our clients. Um, I started my career as a legal aid attorney here in Georgia with Georgia Legal Services Program, representing immigrants not on immigration law, but on everything else. I was mostly representing survivors of gender-based violence on protective order hearings in rural courts across Georgia, which was quite an experience as a new attorney right out of law school. And um, I loved my experience at this organization. I highly recommend it as an experience for folks that are wanting to do civil rights practice generally. It's almost like a residency for for attorneys. You learn how to learn the law and practice it really quickly. So everything from housing to school discipline to public benefits I was doing. But unfortunately, I did experience race and pregnancy discrimination during my time there. And I actually became a very active member of our union. We had a legal services chapter or division. I know you know about that with the protests that have been happening in New York. I was part of the UAW union as well. And so that kind of got me interested in labor. I also had a case. I used to do unemployment hearings, and I had a case representing a woman in the poultry industry on an unemployment hearing. But I that was kind of my first window into this industry in North Georgia, where, workers are literally working until their hands stop working, and they're getting tendonitis and carpal tunnel, and they're literally feeding us, right? Um, and so while I was going through pregnancy discrimination at my first job, I applied for a contract position with the US Department of Labor. They used to have this position called the H attorney position, and we basically litigated cases involving the H program. So we're hearing about H-1B in the news a lot. I dealt with a lot of cases like in the H-1B program, H-2A, and then migrant labor generally for the wage and hour division. And so I was responsible for litigating cases involving immigrant labor. One of my first cases was against a farmer in the Southern District of Georgia who kind of found a loophole to get around the overtime exemption under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Unfortunately, since the 1930s, farm workers have not been entitled to overtime pay. But under the regs, that was contingent on the produce actually being from the farmers. And this grower was basically buying produce from other farmers and then saying the exemption applied. And we won in court saying, actually, it doesn't. You're buying these onions from other farmers. So those were the types of cases I did. And then I ended up becoming a permanent attorney with the US Department of Labor, a career attorney. So shifting from that contract position. And that's when I began doing occupational safety and health Act cases, OSHA cases, primarily in the poultry industry, but also in construction, in the whole gamut of workplaces that are unsafe. My last uh, case when I was at DOL was against a mental health facility where there were instances of workplace violence, and the hospital was not taking steps to protect their staff, their nurses specifically, from patients when they were having psychotic episodes and were behaving violently and needed, there had to be some interventions put in place. So I did that for 6 years, and that's kind of where I built my expertise on kind of labor and employment issues and specifically safety and health issues. And then I left, and unfortunately, I also went through pregnancy discrimination at DOL. And I bring that up because, the impetus for SOAR was very much around how we treat our staff as well as full humans. And so then I left and I had never practiced immigration law, right? I'd never like done an asylum filing. I'd never represented someone in ICE detention before. And so I went and worked for Tahrir Justice Center, which is a gender-based violence organization or working with asylum seekers who are survivors of gender-based violence. And I started that job 1 week before COVID-19 hit. And so, pretty quickly, even though I wanted to immerse myself in immigration law, I couldn't stop thinking about occupational safety and health because all of our clients were essential workers and they were terrified, absolutely terrified of, asking their employer for things like clean masks, asking for social distancing, asking for all of these things. And outside of DOL, I was finding that even in like the immigrant rights space and even the worker rights space, people weren't thinking about occupational safety and health. And so I did see this need for an organization working at this specific intersection of labor and immigration, and specifically around occupational safety and health, just given the number of immigrant workers that literally die every year on the job and their names go unwitnessed, right? And so that being so prevalent in this country. And so we started the organization, myself and Lynn Damiano Pearson, who has a background in um, death penalty cases. And then she was at Tahare, and then her and I, one, saw the need for this intersection, and then two, really wanted to create an organization where um, attorneys, and particularly attorneys of color, felt safe and we could practice law in a way that wasn't harmful to us and gave us um, gave us the environment that we need. And so Sur Legal is primarily it's run and led by women of color. Most of us are daughters of immigrants, and so it's a really the internal culture of the place is just as important to us as the work that's being done, just so that just personally, I didn't want young attorneys, coming that have come after me, going through what I went through. The law is not a easy place for women of color, particularly when you're doing litigation and when you're fighting for marginalized communities, whether that's low-income workers or farm workers or immigrants. Um, you're not met with kindness in those spaces, and so or professionalism. And so I really wanted to create a space, safe space for brown girls to practice law, I guess I would say.
I like that. And we'll come back to this topic because it's important about, not only the work that we're doing, but, the institutions that we're building. But I want to jump to the current immigration landscape. You have, deep and long experience in Georgia and the South. So what would you say are the most urgent challenges immigrant workers are facing in the US South today?
I think immigrants throughout the country are in a very precarious situation when it comes to just the reality of our immigration system and how it's been set up. If you want to come to this country to work, which so many people want to do, and my parents included, there really isn't a mechanism for you to come and do that unless you are under the H program. And the H program is very limited in what industries it covers. So H-1B, which we're hearing about in the news today, which is modeled on the H-2A program and is a state-sanctioned weapon of trafficking or mechanism for trafficking, um, you know, focuses on, highly skilled workers. So you have doctors, you have engineers, you have all of that. And so we're seeing folks primarily from South Asia being impacted by what's happening. But then you have the H-2A program, which is strictly agriculture. And then you have this H-2B program, which is quote unquote unskilled, which is doesn't exist when it comes to labor in this country. But that is also limited. So for example, if you have a specialty in construction, you want to come and work in construction, you cannot get a work permit. You cannot get, to work. What's required of you is to come in and seek some other form of relief, whether that's asylum or some other form of immigration relief, and you get a work permit, if that application is done properly and goes well. But I think a lot of employers and folks on the quote unquote other side of the aisle do not realize that if I want to leave my home country just to work, right, and I want to send that money home, I want to go back home. I don't necessarily even have an interest in citizenship. There isn't really a path for me to get here. And I was actually just talking about, like, South Asian migration. And you have to kind of also talk poorly about your home country and say you're scared to go back in order to get in. And I think that is a very harmful mechanism. And I think that is the origin of immigration law. Immigration law has, for so long, since the Chinese Exclusion Act, been tied to this racialized system of extracting labor from the global South. So they want us for our labor. They want us to build the railroads. They want us to, really take over the jobs that former slaves were responsible for, right? There's this professor at UNC, Dr. Angela Stussy, and she talks about this ethno-racial succession of low-wage jobs, particularly in the South. So, farms, poultry plants, all of these jobs that are very arduous, are risky to our health and safety. Formerly enslaved folks had to do that work. And during Jim Crow, they had to do that work. And then as the Black middle class grew and organized and got into, other jobs, then other vulnerable communities have been pulled in. And so that's where you see formerly incarcerated folks, you see refugees, you see undocumented people, right? You see unaccompanied minors from Guatemala who don't even speak Spanish, right? We had a 16-year-old boy who died in a poultry plant in 2023 who was from Guatemala. And so very, very vulnerable communities end up in these jobs that no US citizen will do, right? And that is intentional. They want them for their labor, but they don't want to see their wives. They don't want to see their children. They don't want to see any sort of indication of that community settling and developing roots in our communities. And I think we often think about, oh, it's the South, but it's not just the South. It's throughout the country. I think the South is one of the most radical places on earth to do this type of work because it really is a litmus. If we can't do it in the South, where can we do it? Um, and I think the other thing about the South is it is, very staunchly non-union. So Georgia is 96% non-union. And so it's intentional. Since the Olympics here in Georgia, we have had an influx of immigrant labor. Folks are often told to come to Georgia when they get to the border because we have the poultry industry, which is the poultry capital, one of the poultry capitals of the world. We have the carpet industry, we have agriculture, lots of construction. I did a bunch of OSHA cases in Florida in construction, and workers were dying weekly, right? And there's not so there isn't labor organizing in the way that you would see in a place like New York, where you have this like history of immigrant labor organizing. There have been snippets of that, but not anything that has been sustainable. And I think in the South in particular, the unions have not done the critical work of kind of meeting immigrant workers where they're at and understanding their struggles and bringing them into organized labor. That unfortunately hasn't happened. And I think that is really holding labor back. There are some amazing unions, though, like the Union for Southern Service Workers, and that are very interested in supporting their compañeros, their coworkers who don't speak English, who don't might not have work status. But I think that combination of factors is why workers in the South in particular are so vulnerable.
And so, Or just to elaborate a little bit more about these regional dynamics that shape the communities. You talked a little bit about that, but are there particularities in the South that shape the immigrant experience that may inform your lawyering or the organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the immigrant experience in the South is like I said, we don't have, for example, in Georgia, we don't have a worker center, right? We don't have spaces, and a lot of the localities where immigrant workers are working, um, they don't have the infrastructural support for what they need. And they're in very rural areas, right? Gainesville, Georgia is where a lot of poultry workers work, and that's the community Sur Legal has primarily been working with since our founding. Um, they are in a very rural area, Hall County. And so there's no public transportation. They have to take taxis to work, right? Um, and they're in a locality that has what's known as a 287G agreement. And that is an agreement between local law enforcement and immigration and customs enforcement, whereby local law enforcement can act on behalf of immigration enforcement. So the reason why those workers take taxis is that if they're driving without a license and they get stopped, not only are they going to get a ticket or get a citation, they can be put into removal proceedings, right? And there have been some amazing organizations like the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, GLAR, Project South, who have been working on getting localities, counties in Georgia to end these 287G agreements, but in more conservative localities where they primarily rely on immigrant labor, you will find these type of agreements, and it's a way to keep these workers silent, to instill fear in them, right? But what we saw in 2021, there was a liquid nitrogen leak that killed 6 workers, and we worked with this group called Georgia Familias Unidas to start a rapid response to support these workers. And the workers were so incredible because they witnessed 6 of their coworkers died. And then 6 weeks later, there was an ammonia leak. And they were like, what is happening? Are we going to die too? And we really saw the power of building community and trust and organizing because these workers started speaking out. They were like, you know what? We want to file an OSHA complaint because we don't want to go to work and die. We don't want to die like our coworkers. And so there is significant power in, you know, groups of people coming together, learning about their rights and finding ways to enforce those rights. And it doesn't even have to be filing an OSHA complaint. It could be asking for a piece of personal protective equipment. It could be asking for a line to be slowed down in a shop plant to prevent carpal tunnel. So there are, so many things to think about, but yeah, I think workers are made to feel alone. They're made to feel like they have to be quiet. They're made to feel like they have to be invisible, right? We want to see the fruits of their labor, but not them. And I think that is a very painful experience for any human being to feel like you have to be invisible, that you can't experience the fullness of life and the abundance of life because of where you come from and this arbitrary system that has been created in this deeply racist country of whether or not you can get a work permit or not, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think those dynamics plus the lack of infrastructure
Hmm.
to support workers like what you see in places like New York or California where there are worker centers, and we just don't we have we're building that now, or we've been building that, or we're trying to build that. um, and that's part of what SUR is doing, is like who's in the ecosystem and who do we support, and how do we get organizers and people that are committed to their communities to have the tools that they need to support um, their members or the people that come to them.
And so I imagine that there are existing, maybe civil rights oriented groups that have worked with, Black workers who are also in the poultry industry and other, as you mentioned, the transition from sort of this plantations, kind of agricultural labor to include immigrants. So how has been the connection with those groups? Has there been sort of like coalitional work that you can speak to?
I mean, I think there's a desire for more, if I'm being completely honest. I think, after the nitrogen leak, we definitely had
Mm,
labor groups and civil rights groups showing up and expressing solidarity. We had a memorial um, during Workers' Memorial Week in March, 3 months after the leak occurred. And it was this beautiful expression of solidarity with, like you said, Black and brown workers and, white workers across the street saying, "We see you and we're here for you," and holding signs and saying, "This is unacceptable and we're watching how this plant treats you." But I think there hasn't been enough kind of beyond that kind of surface level solidarity after tragedy. Um, I think unfortunately there's some, even with organized labor, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of history, and
mm,
we've seen the unions kind of, especially in other parts of the South, like Mississippi, kind of turn the other way.
mm,
In union shops, in a unionized poultry plant, kind of look the other way when undocumented folks are experiencing something. And so that is definitely an area where we need to kind of continue to build cross-racial, cross-class, cross-status solidarity. Um, but I think in the moment we're in right now, I do hope that groups are kind of seeing,
mm,
I think we're all witnessing the impact of not having cross-movement solidarity, cross-racial solidarity, because we're slowly seeing that each demographic is being kind of come for in this moment. And I think it's a
mm,
unfortunate but necessary lesson that you can't speak for trans rights and not speak for Palestine. You can't speak for, and I think we're all experiencing that in a really difficult way right now. Um, and I think there is a lot of just education, popular education needed on like what is the reality of and how these things are related, the immigration history and racial history. Like Customs and Border Patrol originated with as a mechanism of controlling the movement of Black people, of people that were enslaved who were trying to escape to Mexico. That was the origin of CBP. And
mm,
so we have to be able to thread this needle between um, racialized oppression of Black folks and how that has spread on to other people. And I think the example that came to mind was the SCOTUS decision that we had a couple weeks ago about racial profiling of Latinos. I couldn't help but think back to my 1L constitutional law class, Ren v. United States, and I
mm,
was like, "Hello, this has been around," and brown folk, Latino folk are upset about it, but Black folks have been going through this for decades, right? With the
mm,
fourth, them saying, under the Fourth Amendment, probable cause, racial profiling is okay, right? We should have been scared then, but we weren't, right? And so, because of how racist our society is, right? And so, I think we're having to learn these really, really hard lessons right now. And I never want to say it's too late because it's not too late, but I think there's a reason why folks like, Fred Hampton and all these folks were fighting for interracial solidarity, and I think we need to go back to that.
mm. I'm glad you talked about just, correcting misunderstandings, knowing history and sharing origins of the Border Patrol. And this series is precisely intended to do that, right? Law and Liberation is a public education series. So in that vein, are there, can you sort of maybe name two, three areas where you've seen some misunderstandings, or myths that need to be corrected in your work? And I'm sure there are more, but just to kind of focus us on sort of one or two or three, just to begin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole like my parents came here the legal way like framework. the immigration laws didn't start until much later in the 1800s, and it was so easy. You had to pay a little tax, and you could come in unless they found some reason to not let you in, including like you being a dependent on others, you being ill, you having mental health issues. But again, this we had mostly white immigrants from Ireland and all of these places, and they, were not designated as white people, right? There's always in this history been in the history of immigration law and the concept of citizenry, it's always been around adjacency to whiteness. And I think that's what's landed us in the situation that we're in right now. Um, and so I think understanding the history of immigration law, and I would recommend two books. One is Undocumented by Aviva Chomsky, and the other is Border and Rule by Harsha Walia, because they both do an excellent job talking about this history that I'm talking about around labor and immigration being so like racialized and so tied together in this way.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I think the other myth, or I don't know if it's a myth, but it's just some people don't know, is how limiting our labor laws are, right? So we still have an exemption to overtime for farm workers. Farm workers cannot unionize under the National Labor Relations Act. There are whole classes of workers that are exempted or ignored in our labor laws, as particularly domestic workers, for example. The Occupational Safety and Health Act doesn't apply to them. FLSA doesn't always apply to them depending on their situation. And so I think that's another, I think that's another misnomer. People are like, oh, we have these labor laws. And it's like, well, yes, but they were passed during a very difficult time, very racist time in our history. And the Fair Labor Standards Act passed in the 1930s. And the reason they passed is because they carved out all these racialized exemptions.
Mm.
Um, and so I think there's a kind of a lack of knowledge about that. Um, and then I think there's just I don't know if again, I don't know if this is a myth, but I think there's the problem with movement work and the moment we're in right now and why it's so hard for us to kind of cohesively come together and organize is because of a scarcity mindset around resources and the kind of national or the kind of nonprofit industrial complex, which even starting SOAR, I could not escape from. You have to write grants. You have to, unless you're starting a for-profit entity, you are participating. And I think that creates a lot of um, problems in moments where community needs to come together because people are not trusting one another. They're like saying, "Oh, you're doing this to get money," versus "I'm doing it to show up." And but also I want to pay people to show up, right? And so I think that is a piece of this puzzle that movement space really needs to figure out because like what the folks that wrote the revolution will not be funded at Ignite Women of Color. Movement work has been co-opted by this nonprofit industrial complex, right?
Mm.
And it's been kind of contained and tamed. And we're seeing that right now, right? People have lost grants from the Department of Justice. They've lost, they're having to be very careful about what they say and what they do, what they post. And so that's not movement work, right? If it's being controlled in that way. And so I think that is another area that we have to be able to talk honestly about.
Can you just, in your own words, explain what, for those who may not be familiar, what the non-profit industrial complex is? Because
Right.
I wanted
So,
to reach out to audience that may not be as familiar with.
as familiar, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, the nonprofit industrial complex is really about, how funders um, control the work that is being done and will control movement. So you have a group like the Ford Foundation, right? They do amazing philanthropic work, but they also have a kind of a torrid history that I didn't know about until I read The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. They were funding population control mechanisms in India when around the time my dad fled, right, under Indira Gandhi. Like they were paying for mandatory vasectomies of men in India under and I Ford Foundation paid for that. Like that's just wild to me. And so I think, and then you look at the folks that go into philanthropy and how did they generate their wealth, right? What did they do to generate their wealth? And is that values aligned? And we're seeing that now with everything around political speech and, oh, you better not say anything about the genocide or else this funder's gonna take away your money. So you're really limited from being able to do the work that's necessary because of this industrial complex where your funding, your ability to pay for people is held by those in positions of power, and they are going to articulate what you can and cannot do. Um, and then it's like there's an element of saviorism, right? And
Mm,
we see that particularly in like kind of um, global projects and philanthropy that are done in the global south. So you look at like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their work not being really informed by what the needs are of women in India, right? They come in and they're like, this is the solution, and it's a square, and they're trying to put a peg in there or whatever the analogy is. And so I
mm,
think that that's part of it as well, not being informed. I'm sitting here as a privileged person and I'm like, I know how to solve homelessness. No, I don't.
mm.
Like, and not being like informed, not doing the work of being in community, asking for what they need, and engaging in things like mutual aid and things like that. I think that really limits us, and that's what the quote unquote complex is.
Great. Thank you for that, the specific examples. So I want to turn now to what's happening on the ground regarding sort of increased ICE enforcement and the ICE raids. Wonder if you can speak to what you are seeing kind of in Georgia from your work on the ground with respect to ICE raids and how SUR and other organizations are responding to them.
Yeah, so we had one of the largest ICE raids in history. I don't think it was the largest workplace raid, but it was one of the largest, certainly the largest under this Trump administration. And I think uh, we had been hearing that something was going to come to Georgia, and we weren't sure where. And there's a group in Savannah that does incredible work. They're called Migrant Equity Southeast, or MESE, and they are a hub for the immigrant community in coastal Georgia and based in Savannah. And we have been having issues with this EV belt that was, coming to us under the Biden administration. And this is a very clear example of organized labor not showing up for immigrant workers. So there was all of this excitement about the EV belt and about, labor jobs and infrastructure money coming in. But the reality on the ground was that this EV plant by Hyundai was being built primarily by subs. And so this was a subcontractor or a joint venture of Hyundai. But we have seen at least three worker deaths associated with a Hyundai subcontracting or joint venture facility, and the subs primarily using vulnerable immigrant labor and not providing things like fall protection. So there was a worker death we know of in 2023 where a worker fell from 60 feet and died. And OSHA at the time did give a willful citation, but I've learned that there were two more deaths this year. And I think it was very jarring to the community, particularly because of what we heard about, um, you know, 475 people being picked up. Half of them were Korean nationals that were here on B1 visas to provide technical training and job training to folks on the ground. And then on top of that, there were other nationalities, including Mexican nationals and folks from Chile and other parts of Latin America, and even I think someone from Japan, um, that had a whole array of statuses, right? And had work permits, had pending asylum claims, had been part of this community for decades and have families and all of the things. And um, I mean, um, it was very, very violent how this happened. The way they stormed in, at gunpoint, helicopters, work blocking exit doors, workers having to climb into air ducts, pregnant workers running and hiding in the woods, just completely traumatized everyone in this space. And, you know, um, the things that we're talking about now are, did the employer allow them to come on, and did they look at the warrant, and are there some warrant issues that are there in terms of the scope of what they did and what the scope of the warrant was. But on the ground right now, MESE is working with groups like one of our partners, Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, which is a binational legal nonprofit as well, focused on immigrant labor, between the U.S. and Mexico.
Mm,
And unfortunately, 23 workers of Mexican national origin were forced to sign documents agreeing to self-deport. And we don't know the circumstances, the duress they were put into, and including, I think, folks who had pending applications and were following the quote unquote legal way and had work permits.
mm,
Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, part of its model is meeting workers back in Mexico and getting them their back pay. Um, but yeah, I think there's going to be a huge need. I know MESE and CDM, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, um, a whole consort, Jobs Move America, a whole consortium and ecosystem is really, screening the family members, screening the workers, talking to folks that are detained, and kind of figuring out the immigration issues. CDM is also looking at the labor issues. I know it's our team at SUR is thinking about some policy demands, about, hey, we've been sounding the alarm on Hyundai. Even under Biden, we were very concerned about how this plant is set up. And there are a lot, and from a labor perspective, there's a lot of corruption. In the labor space, we talk about fissured industries or misclassification, where a group like Hyundai can say, we are not responsible for what happened at that battery plant because we are not their employer, when in reality, they might have a lot more control than they're letting on. And so there are issues around back pay and reinstatement and discrimination. Who got rounded up? Did any of the white workers get rounded up? Probably not, right? So there's a whole, and there are amazing groups of experts and organizers that have kind of descended on the area and on that community and providing support, but they're going to need everything from, family law attorneys for the folks that have left and deciding if they have children here, do those children go back to the home country? Do they stay here? If they stay here, who's going to be the guardian of those kids? Like, and like I was saying before we started, when tragedies like this happen, it takes years, if not decades, to recover and to grieve and to process, and to get people to where they want to be. If they were building a life here and they've been uprooted, that's so disruptive to communities. There were children that didn't haven't showed up at school, and it creates real chaos and terrorizes them, which I think is the point.
I think you raise an important point that there were existing inequities in terms of the labor conditions, and that allowed, kind of the ICE enforcement to kind of have these sort of ripple effects. And I think it's important to kind of name the continuity. I wanted to ask you, you know, are there things that an employee, say, if there is an employer that wants to be aligned with workers, are there things that employers could do? You mentioned,
Absolutely.
yeah, about looking at the warrant. Can you name a number of things that employers, could do if they actually wanted to kind of be aligned with their workers during this aggressive ICE enforcement? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done, with respect to the work site, areas that are considered private property. ICE does not have the right to show up without a signed judicial warrant. And so it's very important for employers to get educated on what a signed judicial warrant looks like. And then once they have if they have a signed judicial warrant, meaning it's signed by a federal judge, it's not just signed by some agent with, Department of Homeland Security. If it says Department of Homeland Security on the top, that is not a judicial warrant. Um, so looking at that warrant and saying, you cannot come onto my property without a warrant. I think safety planning too, like, okay, employees, what is our plan if ICE were to come to this workplace, right? And so getting that safety plan in place and training, the CEO of a company or the head of HR might not be there, but so the employee should know, like, where's your warrant? Who do I call if ICE shows up? And then enforcing your rights under that warrant. And I brought this up. I bring this up with employers all the time. Like, you guys fight OSHA warrants. I remember having to go to court for OSHA to get in. Can y'all fight these warrants too? And that includes looking at the scope. So if the scope of this warrant that Hyundai that was enforced against this battery plant, it was limited. I did not say you can pick up 475 people, right? It did not, it had a limited scope. And so when they go outside the scope, you have certain rights as an employer, and so enforcing those rights, getting someone to take ICE to court when that happens. And I think there are other things that can be done too. I've talked to like landscaping and construction companies in my personal capacity about, hey, have some numbers of some immigration attorneys if one of your folks gets picked up. I've also talked to folks about not sending their workers to places like Home Depot to pick up things and, places that we know they're going to be vulnerable. Um, so I think there, and then there's also a lot of resources out there that one of our partners, the National Immigrant Law Center, NILC, they have a whole guide for employers about what to do. For example, if you get a I-9 audit request from DHS, what are your rights and what are the rights of your workers when that happens, and how to comply and also protect your workforce at the same time. So I think there's a lot of I think this is a very important moment for businesses to be talking about this isn't the way, right? That we need that there is a need for this workforce, and the workers want work permits, and the employers want them to have work permits, right? And I think we get caught up in this political battle that we've been at a crossroads at for, since the Reagan administration at least, and we're not getting anywhere. And I think that is a disservice. I think both parties have done a disservice to our communities um, in making this making us kind of political pawns, just like women have been political pawns in reproductive justice and immigrants and everyone where we become political pawns. And I think we're at a moment where the business community needs to be shouting and saying, you're ruining my business and you're ruining my workplace, and this isn't the way.
And what are some strategies that the organizations that you mentioned, like MESA and others, that are utilizing to advocate for workers that might be transferable to other jurisdictions? We know that this administration, has been targeting, of course, Chicago, Los Angeles is thinking about targeting Tennessee and other jurisdictions. But can you name kind of three concrete strategies that you have observed that are, been effective, that can be replicable?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's having a rapid response plan in place and thinking about who the key partners are, who are the key people in your ecosystem, trusted immigration attorneys that will take care of the populations, trusted family law attorneys, training up organizers on some of the things we've been talking about, getting disseminating legal education to a whole a whole community. So as we're hearing these things of who might be up next, really coming together and making a game plan. If we were to get a call from a community member about an ICE raid, who would we call into that space, right? Which is what happened here. I got a call from a predominant, Korean American organizer, and I knew, okay, I know attorneys who have been working on ICE raids in Tennessee and Mississippi for the last 10 years. I'm going to pull them in, pulling in organizers, people that know how to interface with vulnerable worker communities that have in-language capabilities. There was a call in for Korean translators and, Spanish speaking folks. And then there's a multitude of strategies. There's like the direct legal services that are going to be needed, right? There's social services that are going to be needed. We were talking about pregnant workers. I mean, their reproductive care is going to be needed. During these situations, unfortunately, we see a lot of miscarriages in the community because of the stress. And so there's a whole, so really making, I always think back to Deepa Iyer's social change map. And I feel like that mapping exercise is just so important because no one person or no one organization can take it all on. Um, and then, kind of having to stay abreast of what's happening in the immigration sphere, right? Like bond hearings are not a thing anymore that I learned. Like I'm not an immigration expert, but we were thinking about a bond fund, but then we were like, well, is that a good strategy? Because no one's going to get it. And so being able to shift, and then developing trust. Like I said, this is the long haul. There's this urgency. I mean, everyone's cortisol levels were shot. People were up until 10 o'clock at night. People were driving down to Savannah, leaving their own children behind. And so we also have to tend to one another and tend to the secondary trauma. And how do we prevent burnout? I think those are all things that I think are top of mind for me.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those strategies. So shifting now and kind of closing, maybe sort of winding um, the interview to more sort of lessons and reflection of your kind of arc of your work. Where do you find kind of in this moment, right, hope or possibility in the labor movement, in the immigrant rights movement, since you've worked in these different spaces? And you also mentioned reproductive justice. But where do you find hope or possibilities for change?
I think right now I find hope generally in community and in building those relationships outside of like the parasocial relationships that we have, but really, pouring into community and being able to receive back from community. And so, um, I think now is the time we keep us safe is something that has been going through my head. And so I think with everything that's happening, particularly around like censorship and stuff, like I think the value of, talking to someone face to face and having conversations in person with these communities, helping them understand their rights. I think popular education is such a powerful tool that is used in the global South. Where street theater and skits and plays and like bringing some joy into it too, like letting people fully embody what our liberation practices can look like. And so having a neighborhood committee, like, okay, if I should, like, if you're in a neighborhood that has high number of immigrants, what is the safety plan? How do we, and we're seeing such incredible work in places like LA and other localities where they're finding out where ICE is staying and they're going to the Marriott and protesting and getting them to leave places, right? And outnumbering them. And I think there's a lot of power in that. Um, and I think the other thing that gives me hope is these communities of workers themselves. At Sur Legal, I know even though we might not be filing OSHA complaints right now, we're not stopping the discussion around how to keep yourself safe at work, whether that's wearing PPE, whether that's talking about ergonomics and best practices and stretches you need to do so you don't develop debilitating back pain or carpal tunnel. what are the things that we are in control of? We are in control of our day-to-day lives, what we do when we wake up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, that whole day. And so just thinking about what are things we can be doing? We can be training one another. We can be looking out for one another. We can be um, I just kind of thinking through what possibilities still exist, right? And I had a friend who is transgender and is going to get top surgery this week, and it's a terrifying time for trans folks. And I was like, write the name of a civil rights attorney that you trust on your arm before you go into surgery, right? And it's a terrible thing to have to think about, but I think just the safety planning and thinking ahead is how we stay safe.
I think that's really important about the safety planning. And I want to also talk about, since you have, I think you mentioned now, 14 years of work in this space. There are new law students and lawyers coming up. What are some advice that you would give based on your work to them now as they're entering into, I think, a time that really is going to demand so much of them, not only just like personally, but politically, and so just words of wisdom to
I
add.
think the mo biggest piece of advice I would have is pacing yourself and really taking care of yourself, right? I think in the legal profession is very, very demanding. It's exhausting. If you're doing this type of work, there are no boundaries, and creating those boundaries early on. When I was a young legal aid attorney, I would be the only point of contact for some of my clients that was in language that could provide support to them. And so, in some respects, I was also doing the work of a social worker, which was not something I was trained to do. And I wish I had set those boundaries earlier because they're really hard to undo as you go. And I think especially in movement space, when things are so dire, especially as women of color, we are first responders. We have human giver syndrome, and so we pour everything out into that movement. And then if you have children, you have a home, you're having to give there, and then there's nothing left for yourself. And so the work, in order to sustain the work, moving slowly, um, is something I wish I had, you know, I would want that for attorneys, particularly young women, attorneys of color, femmes, to really protect their peace in that sense, because we're in it for the long haul, right? We are still fighting the battles of our ancestors. You and I come from the subcontinent, and what our families went through with partition, like we're still there. We're still doing that work, right? And so um, we have to sustain ourselves. And I think the other thing is like, thinking about the law as a tool in the tool belt. I think sometimes lawyers are not able to really integrate into movement space because there is an elitism, right, that comes with having a legal degree. It's not easy to get into law school. It's not easy to get through law school. It's not easy to pass the bar, and it's very expensive. And so, kind of democratizing legal knowledge, I think, is a huge responsibility of ours for those of us that were privileged enough to get through law school. And we should not be gatekeeping this information. This is the rights of the people. We should be translating it and breaking it down into ways that are accessible. And I think right now, programs like street law programs and know your rights programs and learning how to break down legal concepts for the quote unquote masses is really important. Even here in Decatur, Georgia, where I live, where so many federal employees have been laid off, them knowing their rights, right, about their labor and employment rights in this very kind of esoteric, I don't even know what MSPB stands for, but like the merit system or whatever. Like not everyone knows that. Even attorneys don't know that. And so we have a lot of education to do in multiple areas of the law. And demystifying it. And I think we also just need to let go of this idea of, I think we're having to, that these rights are so guaranteed, and we're seeing that the everything that we thought to be true is not, right? Precedent doesn't matter. What Congress wrote in the law doesn't matter. People can try to write EOs and circumvent that, and then litigation takes a long time. And so I think I think having that perspective of like shifting into policy, shifting into demands, and really thinking outside the box, right? Even if there's not a lawsuit, there are other things that can be done. There can be storytelling, there can be organizing, there can be protests, there can be all sorts of things. And so as attorneys, where can you plug in and provide support?
Great. I'm glad you said that. I guess that's precisely what this series, Law and Liberation, is about. Are there any questions that I know there's so much to cover, but things that you feel moved to share with folks who might be listening to this interview in this moment, like things that we didn't cover that that you'd like to, elevate and bring up as we move.
Um, I mean, I think it's really important to, like I said, just kind of have like face-to-face conversations with people. Um, and I think, t taking the time to like learn about some of this history, and kind of finding those resources so that you can kind of educate your community so that when someone's like, oh, why didn't they come here the right way? You can say, oh, there is no quote unquote right way,
Mm.
and kind of dispel these myths. I think that is really important, especially with the age that we're in with social media. And like I'm overwhelmed by infographics, so I just want to have a conversation with someone these days. So I think that kind of personal education is really important. I've been slowly making my way through this little book called On Tyranny, and it does give me a little bit of hope because it talks about, picking a lane. What picking a lane and figuring out how you're going to resist, how are you going to fight? And it could be something as simple as I'm volunteering at my son's library,
Mm.
right? And I found out that there was a hijabi that was bullied. And so I was telling the librarian, here are some graphic novels I think we should get about I love Huda Fahmy's graphic novel series about a teenager in Dearborn who wears hijab, and she moves from a school where she was the only hijabi to Dearborn, and so she has to figure out her identity because everyone's a hijabi there. And I think it's such a beautiful book because it shows the experience of a teen girl, and kind of opens this window for kids that maybe aren't have never been to a place where in like Dearborn, right? And so I think there are a lot of like seemingly small things that you can do that really make an impact in a person's life, and kind of change the course that we're on. And whether that's in your kid's school or your neighborhood cafe, printing out Know Your Rights posters and putting them around, like there's so much that you can do.
I, in addition to your amazing lawyering work, you are also an author of children's picture book. And I was
Yes.
wondering, yeah, if you can talk about how and that fits into your fight for immigrant worker rights, and how do you think that contributes in any, how does it, and you've talked about that, about, making sure that our libraries have like books that represent, various stories. Do you see a connection?
Yeah, I absolutely see a connection because I think as a mother, like part of doing social justice work is it includes mothering and raising good human beings and raising children that understand our history and understand what's happening in the world. Even, my son was 5 years old when George Floyd was murdered, and we talked about it. We
Mm,
talk about police brutality and policing and the system of policing not being what our society needs.
mm,
And so giving children, those skills makes them into people that can organize a workplace, people that can fight for immigrants. And so I started writing children's picture books really to kind of address my own wounds of being raised, being in the South. My first children's picture book is called Lakshmi's Much. I have a Spanish translation here. And
Yeah.
it's about a South Asian girl, an Indian American girl that has a mustache, which means mustache in Hindi. And she has a mustache and she gets teased.
Mm,
And the motivation or inspiration for the book was I was on mat leave with my daughter and my friend Sonia, who's Pakistani American, called me, and her 6-year-old at the time came home crying because she got teased for her mustache. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she's like, what should I do? I don't want to take her to get it threaded or removed at 6. And it brought back all of these memories for me. And so I wanted to write a picture book about body hair, and a picture book about how femmes and women, we have hair, we're hairy. Um, and I do think there is a power in children's literature, broadly to talk about things that kind of are done to children at a very young age, around what they look like, seeking adjacency to whiteness, what's considered beautiful, what's considered
yeah.
um, attractive, what's considered successful, all of these messages that we get really, really early on that kind of push us into the moment that we're in. My second picture book is called I Love My Body Because, and it's about fat phobia. And that is certainly a labor and employment issue where
Mhm.
we don't have protections for people who are, designated or considered fat in our society, and the body shaming and the ridicule that fat folks go through is absolutely unacceptable. And so starting at a very young age, talking about how there are all sorts of bodies in this world and all bodies are good, right? And not judging people for their abilities or disabilities, their shape, their size, their color. Like these are all stories about being a good human being. And I think that is what leads to things like a just immigration system, a just workplace. I think a lot of times we replicate models of harm that from our childhood and from our early days in schools and all of that. I mean, in school is where they train you to become workers, right? They don't let you go on the playground anymore. I'm struggling with this with my daughter. Like she's only 8 and she has homework and she just wants to play. And I think the way we're seeing primary education, it's capitalism at work, like, oh, we want to make them worker bees, and if they don't comply we're going to give them an ADHD diagnosis and medicate them. And part of that is real. ADHD is real, but I'm like, what caused ADHD? Like with these diagnoses that we're getting are related to late stage capitalism. And so that is something that is important to me as a mother, but also when I have hope, when I think about hope, I do think about children, and I think about making sure that they see the world for what it is, even in my own family, right? I am a Hindu Punjabi, daughter of Hindu Punjabi refugees, but explaining to my children that what did life look like in pre-partition, pre-British Raj India or Punjab specifically, and there were, we have ancestors that were Sikh, we have ancestors that were Sufis, and there was this beautiful blend of these cultures and religions that coexisted before the divide and conquer methods. And I think we have the ability to have those conversations in diaspora in a way that we can't back in the home countries. And so I think that that's important to me, right, as I raise these global citizens.
Thank you so much. So just the last question that I asked all the interviewees is, and if you need a minute to think about, is what does liberation look like for you? What does liberation look like? What does it mean to you? How would you define it?
I mean, when I think about liberation, I think about like just full freedom and abundance and like time to rest, time to take care, like where we escape the the structures that have been put in place on us from
Mm,
imperialism, from late stage capitalism, from white supremacy. I've been really, you and I were talking before the interview started about me experiencing really bad burnout, having this career for as long as I did, starting an organization and being, mother to 2 young children. I'm really studying the healing justice movement and folks like Octavia Rahim. I just actually went to a retreat with her over the weekend, and particularly for um, people from the global South and African Americans, like this idea of like rest as a sacred ancestral right, and this idea of like work, even in movement work, like work is still work, and it can't you can't divorce yourself from your humanity and your need for joy, your need for rest, your need to replenish yourself
Mm,
and keep your cup full, and finding practices that enable you to do that. And I think that's especially important in this moment now when, I have so many of my comrades that are Black women saying, well, my ancestors survived slavery. And so I'm going to dig deep into those practices of singing, of dancing, of resting, of joy. And I think liberation is our ability to do that. We can be free now,
mm,
right? I think that's a lesson that we can all take, or that I'm trying to learn, that we can be free now, right?
mhm.
And that's a lesson I want everyone to feel, whether you're um a poultry worker in Gainesville, whether like there are even just like a small like yoga nidra practice in your bed. Like what are tools that we can have to regulate our nervous systems, to stay grounded and to stay connected with each other? That to me is I feel like the liberatory work.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to, this has been so amazing in the sense that brought such a holistic perspective, and just want to thank you for an excellent
No, thank you for having me. I definitely think the sabbatical helped me. If you did this with me a year ago, I would have had like bags under my eyes. And I feel very grateful